We are able to purchase physical copies of old music, also letters, other artifacts that deal with Newport's history, also digital. We have over 1,000 pieces of music about Newport digitally. If it was physical, I probably wouldn't have a place to live. It would all be sheet music.
Hello, and welcome to episode 17 of the Bandwagon Podcast for the week of June 17th, 2024. On this edition of the program, news and notes from the band world, including a rant about selfishness and other things, a story about one of the band world's most famous people, another band-related internet rabbit hole of the week, and a conversation about digging up musical artifacts and bringing them back to life. I'm your host, Rob Hammerton. Hello, dear listener. Here's a heads up. This week's first strain is going to be a rant. This is a sorry, not sorry situation, and it's going to force the rest of the podcast to work hard to lighten the mood again, which it will probably do. But one particular news item just activated my that's all I can stands because I can't stands no more instinct. It starts out not specifically to do with band, but it eventually, of course, has everything to do with band and music and the arts and humanities and short-sightedness. So, pull down the safety harness on this ride, because here we go. Let's play the first strain. In this episode's first strain, news and notes from the band world. Dateline, Franklin, Massachusetts. Credit to the reporting of Tom Benoit, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, a reporter for the Milford, Massachusetts Daily News. Voters in the town of Franklin voted narrowly to reject a $6.8 million tax override in a special election last Tuesday. This will require the town to fill a $6 million plus hole in its budget for fiscal year 2025. Just over 45% of Franklin's voters showed up to address a request to raise an extra $6.8 million in real estate and personal property taxes. The measure failed by just 236 votes. Most of the override money would have gone to the Franklin Public Schools for line items including contractual obligations and special education, according to an override pledge previously made to residents by the town council. The remaining money, about $500,000, would have gone toward increases to general town and school facility operating expenses. The override's failure will lead to budget cuts to school programs and the loss of school department jobs. Last week, a reported 47 teachers received pink slips, which warned them that they would be laid off if the override failed. Had the override passed, the average Franklin homeowner's annual tax bill, currently about $7,700, would have increased by about $550 for fiscal 2025, according to an override document provided by the town. That increase would be in addition to the normal annual increase that's allowed under Proposition 2.5. Proposition 2.5 was a ballot measure approved by Massachusetts voters in 1980, which changed state law so that the total amount of property tax that a city or town can assess each year cannot increase by more than 2.5% per year, plus the impact of any new growth. Prop 2.5 was backed by a number of anti-tax activist organizations. But residents can override this limit by a majority vote. Such an override would enable a community to permanently increase its tax levy limit. Overrides are not uncommon in Massachusetts. Last year, one town's voters approved a $1.35 million override to avoid the closure of the town's library and senior center. And earlier this month, another town's voters passed a $750,000 override to fund the hiring of 6 additional paramedics for its fire department. Now, that's a lot of numbers. And there is research that suggests that news stories that just rattle off numbers see a sharp, almost immediate decrease in reader or listener engagement. Are you still there? Hello? So let's put this in terms that will hold your attention a bit better. The Franklin Education Association issued their estimate of what school department programs would face cuts in the event of an override. They said that if the ballot measure failed, Franklin schools would lose, among other things, the middle school orchestra, the middle school chorus, the 6th grade band, and the high school's theater program. And 7 of the district's 12 performing arts teachers would be laid off. And this is happening. It's the will of the people. It's yet another example of a city or town failing to prioritize public education. Yes, it's true. As a former public school teacher, and as the brother of a current one, and as the friend of legions of them, I cannot claim to be unbiased here. And I am well aware that there are people who are experiencing the kind of financial issues that will cause them to genuinely worry about increases in their property taxes. I do not mean to demean these people or downplay this problem at all. With the exception of a very few fabulously wealthy people in this country, people face economic stress and hard financial decisions all the time. And this podcast is not about economics or distribution of wealth or that sort of thing, but it is in some way about the development and maintenance of humans and their well-being, specifically by way of the celebration of band, which is a subset of music, which is a subset of the arts, which is a subset of the ways in which humans remain humans, by maintaining a culture that is not dominated merely by bean counting, but rather includes strong emphasis on what makes humans human to begin with, by placing at least equal importance on people as on, well, beans. And I am sick to death of all the instinctive, knee-jerk dumping of budget reduction requirements onto our public education system. Since I entered high school in 1980, to the lilting strains of the Proposition 2.5 Read My Lips No New Taxes song, I have lived in a world where public school teachers are constantly looking over their shoulders, fearfully anticipating the moment when that pink slip would arrive in their mailboxes, that moment when their programs would be threatened, reduced, eliminated. And in the case of performing and visual arts teachers, knowing that they would likely be first in line to get that kind of news. Whoever came up with the terms non-essential employees and made the word extracurricular synonymous with unimportant, I'd like a word. I have had it up to here with the standardized testing obsession of our educational leadership, local, state, and federal. Of course it's important that people are good at reading and writing and calculating and understanding history and being able to science, so that we're not all characters in the movie Idiocracy. And it's important that people are physically fit, so we're not all blobs like the folks on the giant spaceships in the movie WALL-E. And it's very important, particularly now, that people are helped to understand how our system of government is supposed to work, and that people are taught to critically think for themselves, so that they know which media outlets are lying to them and which ones aren't, so they know what's propaganda and what's not. I get all that. Oh, do I? But the short-sightedness of constantly, incessantly going to the education well and hauling out buckets of resources will wear on a fella after a year or 2 or 10 or 45. Now, the word band has only been uttered once since this first strain began, you may notice, and you are no doubt wondering, have I stumbled onto a speech by a guest host on Diane Ravitch's education podcast? And yeah, she's done one, but it hasn't had a new episode in about 10 years. She's more the blog type. But students sign up for and adults participate in school and community orchestras, school and community choirs, school and community theater programs, school and community visual art activities, for the same reasons that most listeners of the Bandwagon podcast participate in school and community bands. We don't need to enumerate those reasons here, we know them. And yes, we list off all the extra musical reasons why band and music and the arts are important in children's early lives, all those doing better in English and math classes and preparing students for the 21st century workforce reasons that make us grind our teeth. We do this so that the unimaginative and or balanced budget-obsessed educational administrators and politicians in our towns, states, and country can have some rationalizations that will make sense to them about why they shouldn't axe yet another cultural program this time around. Because somehow, the effects of arts program participation on children's mental health and, their development as well-rounded human beings, they don't show up as line items on a fiscal balance sheet. And don't get me started about the corporations and other ultra-wealthy donors who exert influence on the decisions of politicians, making sure that they get theirs, that they keep theirs, that they get to pay as little in taxes as possible, the rest of society be damned. They don't care whether that rising 6th grade kid will get to continue developing as a musician and as a human in her band class. They don't care whether that rising 9th grader will get to learn about the human condition and his own condition through participation in a theater program. They just don't care. We care, though. You and I. We do. It's just that most of us, I assume, don't have the kind of fabulous wealth that could be applied to the bean counters and the decision makers to get them to see things our way. So what do we do? What little we can. If you think that starts with building a little community of band supporting, music supporting, arts supporting, human race supporting people through a little fledgling podcast, well, heck, I'm with you, obviously. If it's some other activity, do that. Whatever we have to do, in whatever little ways we can do it. Rage against the machine. With a smile on your face, of course, even if it's a sarcastic smile. You gotta start somewhere. Meantime, spare a thought for the students of Franklin, Massachusetts, and for the students of other towns and cities in that state, and in this country, and in the world. as they continue to have the activities that make them proper humans and that they find, fun, removed from their lives because somehow we just can't afford it. You understand. That's news and notes from the band world for this week. If you have a news item you think should be included in this segment, send me a link via email to heybandwagon@yahoo.com. I'll take a quick break now, which will not remotely help me chill out, and then I'll try to find some silver linings. Yeah, I will. After all, this is Bandwagon. Okay, let's pick it up with the second strain. In this week's second strain, it's very important to note that I cast no aspersions on this podcast. Different people know different things, even in the relatively close confines of the band world. So if I invoke the name Tim Lotzenheiser and you, a band person, don't know what I'm talking about, I'm not going to yell at you or mock you or ask you, where you been? Because I get into band-related conversations and people ask me if I know this name or that name, and I confess that I don't, and they don't yell at me or do any of that other stuff. Fair is fair, and also treat people with kindness. They'll like you better. But I mean, it's Dr. Tim. Last week, and again next week, you're going to hear a little bit more than usual about this Drum Major Academy thing I've been involved with since 1999, and honestly, in some fashion before that. It's the time of year when the various editions of that week-long summer high school student leadership training program kick into gear, from Colorado to Carolina, from Oklahoma to Ohio, from New Jersey to Massachusetts. At some point during many of the 4 or 5 day clinics that I've been fortunate enough to participate in as teaching staff, the clinic has gotten a visit from a special guest speaker, Dr. Tim Lotzenheiser. Among other things, he's been a college band director, a spokesperson for a number of musical instrument makers, an author of those Purple Essential Elements beginner band instrument lesson books, and the founder of his own company, Attitude Concepts for Today. But mostly, I've known him as a fellow who gives motivational speakers a good name. Because he's a busy fellow, he gives hundreds of motivational talks at programs similar to DMA every year, as well as at music educator conferences and other sundry events, and he's been a regular figure at the Bands of America Grand National Championships. He tends to fly from one clinic site to another, stay overnight at a hotel, give another talk the next morning, leap into a cab or something in order to get to the airport to fly from that clinic site to the next, and on and on. All the while being in his 70s, if I'm not mistaken. To the naked eye, he's got more energy than people half a century younger. I don't know where he gets it. So here's my story, and if you've heard me tell it before in another venue, you probably won't mind hearing it again. That's the way it goes with stories about Tim, or that Tim tells as part of his motivational talks. I've heard a number of his tales a dozen or more times, and they never get old. I hope this one won't either. 2 Julys ago, on a Tuesday morning, Tim flew into Bradley International Airport in Hartford, Connecticut, stayed overnight somewhere, and then bright and early Wednesday morning blew the minds of the assembled Drum Major Academy students at Westfield State University, here in Massachusetts. I stood in the back of the room, admiring his work as always, when the president of DMA, Gene Parks, crept up behind me and whispered, "Can you help me?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Tim needs a ride to the airport. Can you drive him?" In the 2 seconds following that question, I thought, well, it's 35 minutes there and 35 back, and I have to set up my conducting video room equipment for the early afternoon session, and I've got to make sure my laptop can connect to the gear in the room I've never been in because this is a new DMA location, and somewhere there I need to eat lunch. Which to Gene looked like I blinked my eyes twice. I chided myself for even hesitating and thinking about all that stuff. Absolutely I can drive him, I told Gene. I mean, for heaven's sake, one does not pass up an opportunity to spend 35 minutes sealed up in a car with the guru of band-focused music education. On top of that, just about any time Tim and I had interacted before, it had been for about 5 seconds as I waved hello again while he scooped up his luggage after a DMA speech and ran for the door. Tim could, even in just 5 seconds of interaction, make you feel like you were the most important thing in his life at that moment. Because you were. It wasn't an act. But I always marveled at the idea that he even knew who I was. Yes, I was part of the DMA staff, and since his connection with George Parks went back far enough that they used to good-naturedly argue about who had stolen whose motivational speech material first, well, if I was a DMA staff person, I was family. Completely amazing. I shook my head in wonderment every dang time. So when the appropriate moment came, I scooped up Tim's luggage, put it in the back of my little Prius. He climbed into the car, and we set off. And for 35 minutes, try as I might, I could not get him to talk about himself. He kept asking me questions. So, remind me when you marched at UMass? Oh, okay, the mid-'80s. So you marched with Heidi? Oh, you were drum majors together. And after that, you went into teaching? Oh, you were a journalism major? I didn't know that. So how'd you get into music ed? So Boston University came through for you. Good. So how many years did you teach? And when did you first get in with DMA? The closest I came to turning the top of conversation toward him was asking how he'd broken his arm, which was in a sling. Freak accident with a suddenly opening set of double doors. Nobody's fault. Tim, please tell me it's not your writing arm. Well, of course it is. Isn't that the way it works? We got to the airport in plenty of time. I hauled his luggage out of my trunk because I sure wasn't going to let him try and do it with that arm. He gave me a great big bear hug, said to me, "Hey, thanks for this. You didn't have to do that. Great to see you again. Anything I can do for you, you make sure to tell me and it'll get done." And launched himself into the departure terminal on his way to the next itinerary stop. I caught my breath and then drove back to Westfield. A wee confession about the next July, which was last summer, 2023. Same thing. Same DMA, same Westfield location, same schedule. Tim arrived Tuesday night. We saw him on Wednesday morning. But that second summer at Westfield, at the beginning of the week, I actively volunteered myself for Lotzenheiser limo duty. Partly that was because, starred thought, a leader sees what needs to be done and all that. But mostly, I admit, it was out of enlightened self-interest. The previous summer's 35-minute mobile conversation was such great professional development in its own right that who wouldn't appreciate another chance to have it, yeah? If I had been a good person, I would have cast around to see if any other staff member was available to do the airport run. More people should have the chance to experience a Dr. Tim dialogue. As I mentioned, Tim makes the whole conversation about the person he's talking with organically, without their even realizing it. He tells the DMA kids to make it all about the people they're serving as student leaders, and he practices what he preaches. In a perfect world, I should not hog such opportunities. But that time, I did. My DMA experience for this summer kicks off in about 5 weeks, give or take. Again, in a perfect world, I would let somebody else asked to or be asked to ferry Dr. Tim to the airport. I'll let you know how well behaved I am when I find that out. In a moment, I share a conversation about some musical archaeology. Do stay with me if you like. Okay, let's modulate and get into the trio section. This week in the trio section, I'm pleased to be joined by a longtime Rhode Island resident who has performed and conducted music all over the country, but a large musical focus of whose is right there in the place he grew up. He unearths musical artifacts from the ocean state's history and brings them back to life, quite honestly, among a number of other achievements. Please help me welcome to the program Dr. Mark Stickney. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Rob. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for doing this. We go back quite a few years, but it has been almost all of those years since I last had a chance to have a conversation with you. So it's good to see you.
It's good to see you too.
I tend to start out these sessions with a number of questions that help people get a sense as to who they're listening to in case for some reason they don't know who you are, which I find weird. First up, what's your primary instrument?
My primary instrument was tuba, but I haven't actually played probably in about 5 or 6 years. I played a little bit of trombone. That was my first instrument in a local community band in the summer, but it's getting harder and harder to find any time to actually play an instrument anymore.
Because as we will note, this is a busy gentleman. I wonder how you got started playing a band instrument.
Well, my mother's an organist and piano teacher, a church organist and piano teacher, and I went to like every kid went to the music night, and I had longer arms than most younger kids, so they gave me a trombone, which I actually enjoyed, and I still play. So in fifth grade, I started on the trombone. I also took piano lessons before that, not with my mother. She wouldn't let me take piano lessons with her because then every day would be like a lesson. So one of her friends taught me piano lessons. So I guess my first instrument was really piano. My first real instrument that I actually cared about. I liked the piano, but I was never good at it, was trombone.
This is feeling like a very familiar story to me, except my mother wasn't an organist. One day I'll circle back to that, but what's your current band-related role?
My current band-related role is I'm the artistic director and conductor of the Seacoast Wind Ensemble, which is in Kittery, Maine. I've been with them since 2016. And that's really the only band I conduct anymore. I do some work with a local orchestra called the Gilded Age Orchestra of Newport, who we have had some programs at the mansions in Newport.
So, what bands have you been active with in your life, whether it's been playing or conducting or whatever? I can only imagine.
Ooh, that's a lot of bands. I played in the bands at Portsmouth High School in Rhode Island, not the New Hampshire one, the Rhode Island one. At Gettysburg College, where I went to school, Montclair State, Rutgers University, where I got my doctorate. But also, I've conducted bands at Southern Utah University, Oklahoma, Plymouth State in New Hampshire, and also played with the Salve Regina University band in Newport, Rhode Island. That's the last group I've actually played with. I played for their commencement, not this year, but the 2023 commencement services for them.
I'm sure I read somewhere that early in your life you were involved with the Newport Music Festival. Do I have that right?
Yes, the Newport Music Festival, which is now called, I think, Newport Classical. But when I was 14, my parents, who were working with the director at the time in the office, helping out, doing volunteer work, but also my dad did some computing work for them. They got me a job on the production crew just to get me some experience in the summer and probably to get rid of me in the summer. I stayed with them for about 29 years. I took over leading the production staff after about 10 years, so my early 20s. And I ran their production for the rest of the 29 years I was with them. And when there was a turnover in management, I decided it was time to move on. And as much as I enjoyed it, it was nice to have some free time in the summer.
I read that resume bullet point and got thinking, I wonder if that was, it had to have been the start, but I wonder if that kind of solidified enough of a connection with Newport that it made it a little bit easier to, I'm sliding right into your big project here, but it made maybe a little bit easier or more obvious to slide into your interest of music that historically has been part of Newport, Rhode Island.
It was, sitting in the mansions, listening to performances and being curious as to what would have gone on there, because there's been no real research had been done about Newport's musical life, minus the, Jazz Fest, Folk Fest. Everyone knows about those,
Yeah.
And they're great. But what was life like for the average Newport and also the not so average Newporter who owned the breakers? I also work part-time for the Preservation Society, the Newport Mansions, and I've been working with them off and on for over almost 25 years. More off than on, I worked for them for a spurt a long time ago, and then I've been back working with them for the last couple of years in their events staff. So it's been a lot of fun. But those two things, between working the mansions but also just listening to music, really got me wondering what was going on back, mostly in the Gilded Age, but it's expanded a lot since then.
I quite cheerfully studied American history in school, but my grasp of American history between, say, early Reconstruction and about World War I is not great. And of course, that's pretty much the time period that your historic music of Newport research activity is listed as focusing on, the 1850 to 1920. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, maybe fill in some gaps in my understanding.
It originally started as just a private personal research project and curiosity, and it's turned into as of 2022, it's actually a nonprofit. We are able to purchase physical copies of old music, also letters, other artifacts that deal with Newport's history, also digital. We have over 1,000 pieces of music about Newport digitally. If it was physical, probably wouldn't have a place to live. It would all be sheet music. But we also expanded to research the people. We have almost 1,000 names, and they're musicians who would have served at Fort Adams, which is where the Newport Folk and Jazz Festivals are. But that was an active Army fort going back to the 1840s and before, when the original fort wasn't quite there yet. Those musicians were some of the best in the world. They came from all over the world to perform in the Army. Also the Navy base in Newport. And now we're doing tours. We have 2 tours at the local cemeteries, one at the historic Island Cemetery, which goes back to the colonial days of Newport and before. And also at Fort Adams has an Army military cemetery. So we do 2 tours there. And we also are doing now, we just had our first summer concert at Toro Park, which is if you've been to Newport, if you haven't been to Newport, there's this giant stone tower that no one's quite sure who built it. It's everything from the Vikings to Chinese explorers to aliens, depending on who you believe, or the locals. But there used to be a bandstand in that park, and there were performances going back into the 19th or mid and late 19th century. So we brought that back, and we just had our first of 4 concerts. And this is our second year doing that program. So we're trying to expand and get more programming out there, so that we're able to share what we have, not just online.
It seems almost logical. I would hate to think required, but certainly logical in a place like Newport that people know for the live performance festivals and whatnot that might be a part of it. Wouldn't want to necessarily lay extra pressure on you if you hadn't come up with that idea, but it seems it seems a logical thing for that.
Yeah, and a lot of what we're researching is we have the programs from what the bands would have played in the park. You know, the bands from Fort Adams, the local civilian/military bands, the Newport Community Band. They used to print the programs in the newspaper, so you could see exactly what they were playing, which is really, I think, kind of cool.
I'm going to presume that certainly for the time in history, the band world isn't the only musical world served by this music.
No, it's organists at the churches, orchestras. There were a number of theaters in Newport, some of which are still there, sort of. Some of which are gone physically, but the building remnants are still there. The professional performances. I just put something online that's going to come up next week. Sousa's band was in town performing. He came here, I think, 3 or 4 times. Came to Newport to perform on tours, but also just the local musicians, piano teachers, music teachers at the schools. We want to cover pretty much every kind of history. Local composers. There's been a number of composers that came through Newport or were born in Newport. The most important one, and I love telling people this one, is the song "Anchors Aweigh," the Navy tune. Was actually composed by a Charles Zimmerman, who was born in Newport. His father was a member of the Naval Academy Band during the Civil War, and they moved the entire Naval Academy away from the front to Newport, Rhode Island, and Charles Zimmerman was born in Newport. So the composer of "Anchors Aweigh" is a Newport native.
And file that away for future usage. Here it is. In my digging around and reading some things to kind of prepare a little bit for this, I seem to recall reading about your interest in creating a local museum of this sort of thing.
That's our goal. Our goal at the end of the day is a museum. I mean, we have physical copies of music. We have a cover letter that was written by one of the Fort Adams band composers, or band leaders back in, I think, the cover letter is 1910, 1912. And we have postcards of bands performing in Newport, a postcard of the bandstand. And we're starting to accumulate more things. We have a book from the 1850s that was a book of songs bound for one of the owners of one of the Newport's mansions back in the 1850s. So our goal in the end of the day is to have a place and a home in Newport so we can show those things off and let people come and explore Newport's musical history in person.
Would you characterize that project as imminent or down the road, or?
Down the road. No one ever told me starting a nonprofit would be as difficult as it is. It's been fun. I've enjoyed it. When it first happened, the amount of research to paperwork completely flipped upside down to the point where I was almost continuously doing finances, paperwork, which is important in order for the organization to thrive, taxes, all that stuff. Now I've been able to find a good balance. I also have some help, but we have no employees. No one's paid to do this project. All the money that comes in goes to the performances, the tours, the research, and everything. So it's more of a long-term goal. Right now, our goal is to establish a fund to help us purchase more music. There's stuff out there that's way out of our price range that is important in Newport history, and we're working on trying to get funding to get that back, and then we'll focus on finding a home for it.
At least one thing that you and I have in common appears to be the starting of a project and discovering lots of fun things that were not in the original brochure of "wouldn't we love to do this" sort of thing. There's a lot of learning and flash learning to be done about subjects that we didn't care about.
Yes,
Marketing, come on.
I'm a musician. I'm not an accountant. I'm not a marketing person. Yeah. I'm not a social media manager. There's always frustrations, there's always frustrations in doing it, but it's been a lot of fun. And then finding that balance has helped a lot to make it even more fun. I force myself to do the research. I don't have to force myself. I love it. I'll get lost on the computer and just digging into things, and I'll realize, I have to get to work. the job that pays me to do all this stuff.
Yeah.
Oops.
So the challenge, we think, is striking that balance between the fun and the work. And sometimes the needle on the meter is way over here pointing to total fun, and sometimes it's way over there pointing to necessary admin stuff that must be done, and being careful not to let the needle get too far in either direction.
Fun is the wrong word. It should never be too frustrating. I think it gets frustrating, and it gets it bogs you down sometimes with some of the stuff that you're doing. But then you take a step back and realize that how much fun what you're doing really is, and how much I love finding new things. I'm constantly finding new people, new music. Not daily, but at least weekly, if not every couple of days, finding a new person. I come across an article and it's like, oh, that person. I just found someone who was a major organist and composer in Newport in Boston, whose father was wounded in the Battle of Gettysburg. And the irony of that is I'm a Gettysburg College graduate, and I just went back there. So I was back there last week. I had to hunt down the monument for his Massachusetts artillery regiment and get photos of it. But but I'd never heard of this guy even, but he's a big name. His name's Christopher Scott, Charles Scott, excuse me. I haven't quite finished researching him, but he's got hundreds of pieces of music out there.
And in that particular case, there's a name which is, shall we say, not uncommon. So I can only imagine it makes the digging a little much harder.
It gets worse with the Irish musicians from the mid 1800s. We have in the cemetery. I was researching most of the musicians, the band musicians there, and some of the graves are for their children. There's almost maybe a quarter to a third of the graves in that cemetery are soldiers' children who died at the fort going back to the 1800s. And it was just child of Kelly. I'm like, okay, Irish musician with the last name of Kelly. And there were 5 soldiers at the fort at that time with the last name of Kelly. And I was trying to figure out which one it was. I'm like, that's not, it's a pretty common Irish name.
Exasperated exhale. I would judge that my own particular version of digging around to see if I can find somebody from the past, etc., has not nearly been as let's say, fulsome as yours. So I have to only imagine the moment when you either stumble onto something or you go down a path that you suspect might be fruitful and it turns out to be fruitful. And what a moment that is.
It's incredible. It's incredible finding, and since this is a band podcast, well, probably the biggest band guy I found is there's 2 of them. One was a musician who was in the Navy band here, and I came across his obituary, and this was in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He died at the beginning of the 1900s, and he wrote something like 40 marches and other music that was performed by bands all over the country. And one of his pieces, a funeral march, was played by the president's own at JFK's funeral procession. Ooh. During JFK's funeral procession. And I just like, okay, where's the music? The Marines had 1 or 2 pieces. One of the other service bands, I think the Naval Academy, had recorded in the Heritage of the Band series, the old record series, they had recorded half of an album of his music. So I was able to get some from them. But then a friend of a friend who used to work at the Library of Congress thinks they saw music by him once upon a time, and I was able to get about 30 pieces of music from the Library of Congress, all the original band arrangements. Unfortunately, some of them are just the cornet score parts, so those marches we don't know what they actually were like. So finding his music was probably the first incredible moment of thing. And the other example of that was there was a Civil War colonel, or a cavalry colonel by the name of John Rogers in Rhode Island, and there was a music store owner in Newport also by the name of John Rogers. And I was convinced that there's no way that these are the same people. It turns out before the Civil War, he was a music teacher, and after the Civil War, he owned a music store in Newport, and it was a church organist and choir director, or maybe just choir director, excuse me. And during the Civil War, he was wounded at Bull Run, joined the cavalry, and rose to the rank of colonel, commanding Rhode Island's cavalry. And I'm like, okay, they were the same person. So stories like that is what makes it, I think, the most incredible. Like, that's what makes my day.
That moment of score.
Yeah.
Talking of which, that's the worst transition I've ever done in my life, or at the very least, it's the cheesiest one. But in thinking about the idea of you going and purchasing music and then effectively digitizing it, throwing it into music processing software, music notation software, and whatnot. A number of weeks ago on this program, I had a chat with a gentleman who was a grad student at UMass named Richard Sargent, who was doing a lot of research on a Robert Russell Bennett piece. At this very moment, I don't remember whether this made the final edit of the interview, but we were talking about the process of taking sheet music of a certain era, and his was, the 1930s, but yours is, it had to have been handwritten, I would assume.
Some of it is handwritten, some of it is typeset. I have music that's typeset to a certain degree back into the even back to 1830s. There's some music that is typeset, or there was a later version of it. A lot of the music we have was the orchestra music was transcribed for piano to sell, and that's the only thing we have is the piano version of it. The original orchestra parts, which were probably handwritten, are gone. Most likely, they went with the band or the orchestra. But we do have some typeset music. But even the typeset music, once they printed it, if there was a mistake, oops, oh well, keep going. So when you put it in the program, you're like, well, that's not right. So you have to figure out what they actually meant.
Attempt intuitive scholarship, maybe.
Yes. What sounds good?
What did they mean?
Yeah.
As a church choir director, having bumped into or discovered in our church's music library some anthems which, to be kind, are way out of print, and you look at them and the choir asks, what's that little symbol? And I say, oh, that's a quarter rest, but it's how they did it then, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you are dealing with not only perhaps the quality of the literal quality of the materials that you're finding and purchasing, but you're also dealing with the evolution of notation.
Mm-hmm. I have music back to the colonial era, and all that is handwritten. I haven't actually had much of a chance to really dig into that yet. I haven't worked my way back there. In that era, I'm still in the collecting phase. Most of it's hymns.
Let's knock down the Gilded Age first, and then.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, originally this whole thing was the 1850s. There was a big orchestra in town in Newport, in the Northeast, called the Germania Musical Society. And there were a bunch of Germans who came over, and they performed like low 20s number of musicians, orchestra. Conductor was group sometimes, and they performed all over Newport. And I kept seeing mentions of this. Newport at that time was a big summer colony for Southerners, pre-Civil War. Obviously, the Civil War ended that. But this orchestra was everywhere, and I found hundreds of piano versions of their music, but there's very little orchestra music that survives. I mean, these people went on to lead the Handel and Haydn Society, conduct the New York Philharmonic, Boston Symphony. I mean, they were major musical players towards the late 1800s. But their music is all the parts are gone. It's all piano. It only survives in piano. And if I were ever thought of myself as an arranger, I would try to figure out, based on the instrumentation, what it would have sounded like. But it would be my version of their music, not theirs. But so the 1850s was the start of it, and then it just slowly started expanding, mostly modern, because of the whole Gilded Age phenomenon with the HBO show. And I cut myself off at 1920 because anything past that is almost too easy to find things, but also overwhelming in what you can find. So right now we're stopping at the 1920s-ish, and then going back to before Newport was Newport.
So your professional life is full of all kinds of interesting stuff, but it can't answer every band question that there is, particularly the ones that I have. So as we bring this one in for a landing, I would like to pose some slightly different, less resume-oriented questions for you. And the first one that I always go with is, and given your range of experience and research and such, this could be anything, ladies and gentlemen. What's one of your favorite pieces of band music that you've played, outdoors or indoors?
I think the best piece of music I've ever been a part of was when I was at Rutgers working on my doctorate, playing with their wind ensemble, Erica Wazen's Shadowcatcher, with the American Brass Quintet, which was just, if you haven't heard that piece, it's an unbelievable piece. And just sitting there, being in that group, playing, and also hearing them play and trying to focus on my playing as well as listening to them play. And in the group, the Rutgers Wind Ensemble is just a phenomenal group as well. So that would have been my favorite piece of music that I've played or performed. Conducted, well, some people ask me what's your favorite piece. I'll look for something that I'm doing recently. My favorite piece right now is, and it's kind of cheesy, is a piece called the Champagne Gallop, which is we're doing as an encore. We did as an encore for one of the Gilded Age Orchestra programs, and it's got the cork pop and everything with champagne. It's by a Dutch composer by the name of Lumbe. If you look it up, there's a band version of it. It's a lot of fun. It's not too hard, but it can go fast. I think my band loves it. I hope they do, because I love it.
Sometimes you get to look at the band and say, humor me.
Yeah.
So flipping that over on its side, what is a piece of band music that you've never played but you'd like to, or conducted?
I haven't conducted anything by Hovhannes, who's one of my favorite composers. His band symphonies are, some of them have 8 trombone parts, like 13 percussionists. So it's hard to find a group that can handle something like that. I think I would love to get a chance to conduct something by him. Playing, there's some music by John Mackey that I haven't had a chance to play. The Wine Dark Sea, music like that. I think if I were to play, I would love to get a chance to play something like that.
He was up for one of the New England Band Directors Institute weekends, and I'm trying to remember which year it was.
It was, he did the music of session. And
yes.
He said, well, I don't conduct, so you have to. I'm like, what?
Oh, that's right.
With you right there.
Oh, that's right.
It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. I had never met him. I had met him, I think, briefly at Midwest, but I never really had a chance to talk to him. And it was a lot of fun having him there.
Let's see. Oh, don't have any idea what you're going to answer, what your answer is to this one. Is there a band that you would like to perform with that you haven't, either because you're not the right age or not in the right location or don't live in the right century?
I would love to play with the New Jersey Wind Symphony. I don't know if you're familiar with them. Chris Wilhelm,
yep.
Who I've known since my graduate work at Montclair State. One of my band members from Seacoast in Maine is now teaching at Montclair in New Jersey, playing in the Wind Symphony there. I love getting I got a chance to hear them play an arrangement I did of a D.W. Reeves piece with organ at the Macy's in Philadelphia. I'd love to play with them. I need a little more practice to get back in it, though.
A couple of people have said a band that I love to perform with, but I haven't because I'm not the right age or not in the right place or not really live in the right time, or I'm just flat not good enough. That's me.
Yeah. I'm a little rusty.
And finally, is there a favorite band story that you'd like to tell?
Can I do 2 quick ones?
Sure.
One is, as a player, when I was playing at Rutgers, we were performing a piece called Solemn Music by Virgil Thompson, and I was in the tuba section. There were 2 or 3 of us back there, and there's this one tuba playing at the beginning and one tuba playing at the end, and about 1 second into the piece, one of my valves broke on my tuba. Fortunately, the other guy had 2 tubas, one higher, 2 tubas he was playing with, and I was trying to get his attention to one, play the parts, but also, and the director Bill Burrs is just looking at us like why are you having a conversation? He's like laser eyes, like he's gonna kill us. So I get him to play my parts, and he lets me borrow his tuba for the rest of the concert. But then the conductor comes up after Bill Burrs. He's like ready to yell at us, and he looks down at my tuba. He's like, "Oh my God, I couldn't, and then I brought it to Dylan Music, and they're like, "We've never seen that happen before." I'm like, "Well, I'm glad I was the first person." As a conductor, when I was in Southern Utah, we performed. It was a good group out there. I really enjoyed working with those students. We had performed some. I can't remember what we performed, but the group knocked it out of the park. And I was talking to someone at the end, and she said, "I really enjoyed your performance, but I was very distracted." I was like, "What were you distracted by?" She goes, "One of your pant legs was up above your sock." I'm like, "What?" So now every time I go on stage, I'm like obsessed with make sure my pants are right. You can't see my socks just because of something weird like that. I think it's little stories like that kind of stick in my head, for better or worse.
Everybody, remember that when you go out on stage.
Exactly. Check your pant leg.
And this is why we do this podcast, because these are important. Dr. Stickney, we first crossed paths at the New England Band Directors Institute in the area of 10 years ago, something like that. And you were gracious enough to get a wind ensemble composition of mine onto the slate of pieces for one of our repertoire reading sessions one evening, and you actually did a bit more extra work even than that implies, and that's a longer story than we have time for the moment. But I was always appreciative of that opportunity, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk a little bit more about this Newport Historic Music Project. I see social media posts about it fairly frequently, and I always meant to investigate further, and this has just gotten me more firm on the point of needing to get down to Rhode Island for a concert soon. And I
For your audiences, there are some great older band arrangements of marches that are fun to do. Some of them have been performed by some bands around here. My group has done a few of them, so explore that music as well, because it's some really cool music. More importantly, thank you for having me on here.
It was more than a pleasure. Is there somewhere online that people can find this project of yours or anything that you're involved with?
If they go to historicmusicofnewport.org, that's the website. It's got a blog, which needs to be updated. It's been a few weeks since we've done a story. We have a couple in the working. It's got a listing of our events, which right now consists of 3 more concerts this summer with, there's a fife and drum band, an old style brass band, and also 2 concert bands playing down there. They're free, open to the public. Bring a chair, a blanket, enjoy the beautiful day. We have some other events that will be coming up further down the road, some tours, and also some other musical programming we're working on, possibly at the mansions. We also have a YouTube channel, which is just Historic Music of Newport. We've taken some of the music and put it to old-time photos of Newport or things. When we originally started doing it, it was just, here's some weird photos of Newport that have nothing to do with the music. We've tried to make it more relevant with the music, but still sometimes they just have fun. But it's old school photos of bands and of Newport, the mansions in Newport. We also have an Instagram and Facebook pages. If you just look up Historic Music of Newport, you'll find us somewhere online.
We'll make sure to throw the links into the show notes so people can go right there.
Thank you.
Low brass specialist, conductor, researcher, Mark Stickney, thanks so much for chatting with me today. It has been a genuine pleasure.
Rob, thank you so much for having me on.
And after a grand pause, I'll return with a bit more bandwagon. I do hope you stick around. Here comes the dogfight. This week's dogfight is another band-related internet rabbit hole of the week. Where I offer up one of my online excursions that you may be inspired to pursue yourself, thereby completely destroying an evening. You're welcome. This week's rabbit hole of the week, well, I've been sitting on this one for a while. A little more than 6 years ago, I was watching the Rose Parade, and I saw a band take that famous 110-degree corner at a dead run while playing. Never seen anything like that before. The band was identified by the National Broadcast Network only as Green Band from Japan. Forgive me, but I doubted that was their real name, and indeed, a little digging revealed that the band was one of several who have made the trip from Japan to march the Rose Parade. Those bands are part of a Japanese organization called the Green Band Association. Green Band was established in 1998 in the Japanese city of Sendai as an international brass band organization with an environmental protection purpose. Its members travel internationally to perform, and the freewill donations from their concert audiences are used to support tree planting, animal cruelty prevention, and other related activities. So that's the background. And now, the actual rabbit hole, featuring probably the best known of those bands, the Kyoto Takebana Senior High School Band. They are distinctive for several reasons. Reason 1. Their uniforms, bright gold tops, orange skirts, black knee socks, well, except for the males in the group who wear black pants. Reason 2, the band doesn't have that many males in it. Kyoto Takebana is always at least 95% female. Reason 3, Takebana's repertoire is dominated by Disney medleys and pop tunes, and not just watered-down arrangements. Musically, as they say in drum corps, the demand is high. Reason 4, the physical demands of this outfit are beyond high. I promise, you have never seen a band move like this while playing. The closest thing to this that we have in this country would be the historically black college and university band tradition. Kyoto Takebana dances while playing constantly, to the point that physically, winds, percussion, and guard should not be able to play this well or swing flags this well while executing body movement as frenetically as these kids do. Video taken with cameras at ground level during parades reveals far fewer brass clams than ought to be expected, honestly. And when they're all not playing notes or swinging flags, they're still hopping and bobbing and waving to parade audiences. It's crazy. Now, it's toying with dangerous stereotypes to say, well, this is the Japanese thing. They do some of the most insane things with frightening precision. I mention this partly because I've seen video of some other Japanese bands, and some of them are just okay. It's never okay to whitewash an entire group of people. A lot more of those other Japanese bands are now working to try to keep up with Kyoto Takebana, and not quite making it, and that is no shame on them. Takebana has set the bar for combined music and movement very high, almost unreachably high. There's a documentary video out there, which I've linked in the show notes, along with a few other videos to get you the idea of what this is all about, which shows rehearsals and sectionals and all kinds of behind-the-scenes footage about how they prepare what they do and how they train. And yeah, it's training. To do the physical things that are asked of them, they have to be in ferociously good physical shape. And you think college football teams need conditioning programs. They ought to check these kids out. As was described a bit in last week's trio section, the Rose Parade is 5.5 miles of pavement, and the Takebana kids are moving and dancing the whole time. Add to that, at no time will you ever see any individual going through the motions. It seems like their repertoire is designed to prevent this. If any of them put less than 100% into what they're doing, it will stand out. And you just never see that. Remarkable. It takes commitment, not just to the ensemble in general, but to every single second of a performance. For that reason alone, any video of theirs that you start watching, you will finish. It's enthralling, especially for anyone who knows what goes into doing this stuff. Well, quite often I've said, okay, one last pause to catch our breath. And this week I really mean it. I mean, go watch some Kyoto Takebana videos via the links in the show notes, and I bet you'll be winded just watching. They're incredible. Anyway, in a moment, we'll bring this episode in for a landing. Thanks for continuing to listen. To wrap up this week, let's take the coda. For the coda this week, see, I told you this episode would have a story arc. Yeah, I started out pretty peeved, and I haven't lost that. It's seemingly an ongoing fight to preserve the band activity, to preserve musical activities and studies in public education. Heck, to have to constantly present justifications for why that should continue. It's just nonsense. But thanks to memories of Dr. Tim, and thanks to Mark Stickney's descriptions of his work to preserve Rhode Island's musical history, and thanks to those perpetual motion Japanese band kids, I'm back to smiling while I carry on the fight. Chin up, everybody. Eyes with pride. That's Bandwagon for this week. Thanks as always for downloading and listening. Bandwagon was written, researched, and produced by your humble host. Musical interludes were produced by Hammerton Media, from source material largely by John Philip Sousa. You can listen to more episodes at our website, heyband.podbean.com. Please give me feedback, be polite, but let me know what you like and what you think might change. You can do that using our email address, heybandwagon@yahoo.com, or leave us a 90-second voice message by going to speakpipe.com/heybandwagon. Be aware that we do reserve the right to include your message on the podcast unless you say otherwise. All those contact links and links to our news items, conversation topics, and my interview guest, Mark Stickney, can be found in our show notes. Please share the show on social media, and thank you for that. If you enjoy this podcast, get someone else to listen as well. As it turns out, word of mouth really is the best recruiting tool. And to keep up with us every week, subscribe to Bandwagon on the Podbean app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Rate and review. It really helps other people to find the show. For now, take care, stay in touch, stay in tune, and we'll do all this again next week. I'm Rob Hammerton. Detail, fall out.